She arrived at his door with nothing but a dead man's letter and a desperation she was too proud to name. He hadn't spoken to another human being in 11 days. Some men out here were broken by the frontier. Brennan Vale was something worse. He'd made the frontier break first, and everyone within riding distance knew it. They told stories about him the way they told stories about winter storms and wolf packs. You didn't seek him out. You didn't knock on that door. She knocked anyway, and what happened next changed both their lives forever. Drop a comment with your city. I want to see how far this story travels. The canyon had a sound in late autumn that Brennan Vale had never bothered to describe to anyone, mostly because there was never anyone to describe it to. It was a low, dry moan that came up through the rock walls when the wind shifted north. Not quite a howl, not quite silence. Something caught between the two. The cottonwoods along the creek had gone bare 3 weeks back, their branches now like cracked fingers scratching at a sky that couldn't decide between iron gray and the pale yellow of a bruise. He was splitting firewood when the dog went still. Rex wasn't much of a dog, half shepherd, half something meaner, with one torn ear and a permanent suspicion of anything that moved after dark. But the dog's instincts were better than most men's common sense, and when Rex stopped pacing and stood with his nose pointed toward the south trail, Brennan set down the axe without thinking about it. He waited. The canyon played tricks with sound, carried things from a mile off, swallowed things that were 50 yards away. He'd learned years ago not to trust his ears here. He trusted the dog. 60 seconds. Maybe 90. Then the sound of hooves on frozen ground. Slow. A horse that was tired or a rider that wasn't pushing. Brennan pulled his coat tighter across his chest, not because of the cold exactly, though it was cold enough, and moved around to the front of the cabin where he could see the trail open up along the lower ledge. The rider appeared through the stripped tree line, and his first thought was that it was a boy. Small in the saddle, bundled in a coat 2 sizes too large, hat pulled down. Then the horse cleared the last stand of bare brush, and he could see better, and it wasn't a boy. It was a woman. She rode a roan mare that had seen better days, ribs showing through the coat, the kind of tired that came from being ridden too far on too little feed. The woman herself sat straight despite everything, which told him something. You either learned to ride with your spine or you didn't, and the ones who did had usually been on a horse since before they could remember. She pulled up about 20 feet from the cabin and looked at him. She had dark circles under her eyes, and her cheeks were raw from the wind. She didn't look afraid, which was unusual. Most people who came up the canyon unannounced looked at least a little afraid of what they'd find. "Are you Brennan Vale?" she asked. Her voice was steady. That was the second thing he noticed. "Who's asking?" "Evelyn Mercer." She pulled off her right glove and reached inside her coat. "Thomas Mercer's daughter." The name landed like a stone dropped in still water. Thomas Mercer. Brennan said nothing for a long moment. Rex had moved up beside him and was watching the horse with professional skepticism. "Your father send you?" he finally asked, though something in the way she'd said the name, Thomas Mercer's daughter, not my father sent me, already told him the answer wasn't going to be simple. "My father died 6 weeks ago," she said. "He left something for you." She held out a sealed letter. Her hand didn't shake, but the effort of holding it steady in the cold was visible. Brennan crossed the distance between them, took the letter, and looked at it. Thomas Mercer's handwriting on the front. He recognized it from the last letter the man had written him, 3 years back, asking nothing and offering less. Just checking in, the way Mercer had always done. Steady as a fence post, stubborn as one too. "Get down," Brennan said. "Your horse needs water." He put the mare in the small lean-to paddock beside the barn and threw her a half ration of hay. The horse drank from the trough in long, grateful pulls. Evelyn stood nearby watching, and he noticed she checked the mare's legs before she did anything else, ran her hands down the near foreleg, feeling for heat. Another thing that told him something. Inside the cabin, he put coffee on. The place was what it was, functional, without any attempt at comfort. A plank table, 2 chairs that didn't match, shelves of canned goods and tools mixed together without apology. A rifle above the door. Pelts stacked in the corner waiting to be sold. A wood stove that did its job. Nothing more. She sat down at the table with her hat in her hands and looked around the room without making a face about it. "You want to read it alone?" she asked. "Makes no difference." He broke the seal. Thomas Mercer wrote the way he talked. No wasted words, no softening of edges. Brennan, if Evelyn is delivering this, then I'm gone. I'm not going to apologize for that. And I know you'd rather I didn't. I want to tell you something before I get to the ask. You are one of the better men I have known, regardless of what you think of yourself or what other people say. I have watched you long enough to know that's true. Now the ask. Evelyn has no one. Her mother passed 4 years ago. I have debts I'm ashamed of, and when they settle my estate, there will be nothing left. She is capable and strong, stronger than she knows. But the frontier is not safe for a woman alone, and I am not willing to leave her to the charity of people who would use that against her. I'm not asking you to give her money. I'm not asking you to find her a position. I'm asking you to think about whether there is any version of a life on that canyon that might work for both of you. You need someone, whether or not you'll admit it. She needs somewhere safe. That may be the whole of it. That may be enough to build from. I trust your judgment. I always have. Whatever you decide, don't let her sleep in the cold. Thomas. Brennan read it twice. Then he set it on the table and looked at Evelyn. She was watching him with an expression that was hard to read. Not quite anxious, not quite blank. Somewhere in between. Like a person who had prepared for several different outcomes and was waiting to see which one arrived. He tell you what he wrote? Brennan asked. He told me the general shape of it. And you wrote up here anyway. I didn't have a lot of other options. Something moved behind her eyes. I know how that sounds. I'm not here to be a burden. I want you to know that from the start. Whatever you decide, I'll accept it. But yes, I wrote up here because my father trusted you, and I don't have another door to knock on. The fire popped inside the stove. Outside, the wind had picked back up, running its flat, cold hand along the exterior wall. Brennan sat down across from her. He folded his hands on the table and looked at them for a moment. The knuckles, the old scars, the missing tip of the ring finger on his left hand from a rope accident 6 years back. Your father saved my life, he said. You know that story? Some of it. 13 years ago, I was 23 and I was doing things I'm not proud of, and I got into a situation that was going to end me. Mercer pulled me out of it, didn't ask why I was in it, didn't lecture me afterward, just got me out and told me to go somewhere better. He paused. I didn't go somewhere better right away, but eventually I did, partially because I didn't want to waste what he'd done. Evelyn said nothing. She was listening the way her father used to listen, completely, without filling the silence. I don't know what kind of man you think I am, Brennan continued, or what you've heard. Some of it's probably true. I'm not going to sit here and tell you I'm something I'm not. I'm not asking you to. I live alone because I do better alone. I'm not easy company. I work hard, and I expect the same from anyone sharing the same roof. I have a temper that I manage, mostly, but it's there. He looked up at her. Those are things you should know before I say anything else. She held his gaze. All right. Your father's letter is asking me to consider marriage, practical arrangement, the kind where two people decide that partnership makes more sense than the alternative. He watched her jaw tighten slightly at the word marriage, not with revulsion, more like recognition. Like she'd known that was what the letter said and had been carrying the weight of it the whole ride up. That's what he asked, she confirmed. I'm not asking you to love me, Brennan said, because it needed to be said plainly. I'm asking you to think about whether you could tolerate a life here. It's hard, it's isolated. The winters are worse than you've probably seen. I'm not a comfortable man. I've been comfortable, Evelyn said. Comfortable didn't keep my father alive or keep our creditors away. She set her hat down on the table. I know how to work. I know how to keep a house, manage accounts, plant a garden, handle a firearm. I'm not delicate. I grew up in a frontier household. That's not the same as this household. No, but I'd rather face hard and honest than easy and uncertain. She paused. I'm not asking you to love me either. The coffee had finished. Brennan got up, poured 2 cups, and set one in front of her. Neither of them spoke for a moment. How bad are the debts? He asked. Significant. I managed to settle the largest ones with what livestock was left, but there's still a claim against the property. The land will be gone within the month. I have what's on that horse and what's in my saddlebags. That's it. That's it. He nodded slowly, not in agreement with anything specific. just acknowledging the reality of it. Outside, the light was beginning to fade. The canyon got dark early, the walls cutting off the sun long before the rest of the world gave it up. He'd lived with that for years. Some evenings it felt like the world just shut off and left him with the fire and the dog and the dark. "You'd have your own room," he said. "Small one, but yours. What this becomes over time, that's something we'd figure out as we go. I'm not going to make you promises I don't know yet if I can keep." "I don't want promises," Evelyn said. "I want a fair arrangement between two people who are honest with each other." He picked up his coffee cup. It was chipped at the rim, the handle replaced with a length of twisted wire after the original broke 2 winters ago. He should have gotten a new one by now. He never had. "There's a town judge in Ridgepoint," he said, 40 miles south. "He does marriages. If you want a few days to think on it—" "I've had 6 weeks to think on it." She picked up her own cup and held it in both hands. "My father wrote that letter the morning before he passed. I found it on his desk. I've been thinking about nothing else since." "And?" She looked at him directly across the scarred table, this woman who had ridden 40 miles through cold and fear and pride to knock on a door that most people rode around on purpose. "Yes," she said. The nights got down to 8 degrees that week. Brennan knew because he had a mercury thermometer nailed to the exterior wall of the cabin. Thomas Mercer had given it to him some years back, and every morning he checked it the way he checked the sky. Not to feel anything about it, but to know what he was dealing with. He gave Evelyn the small room off the back of the cabin. It had been a storeroom once, still had shelves along one wall, but there was a narrow bed frame he'd built and never used, and he found a tick mattress rolled in the barn, musty but intact. And after she beat it outside for 20 minutes, it was serviceable. He brought in an extra blanket without being asked. She thanked him without making a thing of it. She didn't ask questions that first evening. She helped him with the evening chores, feeding the horses, breaking ice on the water trough, bringing in the last of the wood he'd split that morning. She worked without commentary, which he appreciated. He'd always found that the hardest thing about having someone around wasn't the company itself. It was the noise of it. The endless filling of silence with words. She didn't fill it, she just moved through the work. That night, after she'd gone to her room, Brennan sat by the stove with Rex at his feet and tried to examine what he'd done. He wasn't given to second-guessing. It was a quality he'd developed deliberately, the way a man could develop calluses on his hands by repeated exposure to rough work. You made a decision, you stood by it, you fixed what went wrong when it went wrong. But this. He'd agreed to marry a woman he'd met 4 hours ago. A woman whose father had asked him to, which was nearly the same as the man himself asking from wherever the dead went when they left. A woman who was clearly capable and clearly desperate and had ridden up a canyon trail in November to knock on the door of a man with a reputation like his. He turned that over for a while. The fire burned low. Rex snored. "You need someone, whether or not you'll admit it." He'd read that line 3 more times than any other part of the letter. He didn't particularly want to admit it. But Thomas Mercer had a way of writing true things, and Brennan had learned at some cost that dismissing true things didn't make them less true. They rode to Ridgepoint 4 days later when the weather opened up enough to make it practical. Ridgepoint was a rough kind of town. Not rough in the dramatic sense, not the kind you read about in the dime novels that showed up in saloons and disappeared just as fast, but rough in the practical sense. Buildings that were mostly functional and partly falling apart. Streets that were either dust or mud, depending on what the sky had done lately. A population of people who were working too hard to bother with spectacle. The judge was a heavy-set man named Callow, who'd been doing frontier marriages for 15 years and had developed an approach to them that could best be described as efficient. He had them stand in front of his desk in his cramped office that smelled of pipe smoke and old paper, asked them a series of questions in a flat voice, wrote their names in his registry with a steady hand, and pronounced them married in the same tone he might use to announce the weather. "Sign here and here," he said, turning the registry toward them. Evelyn signed first. Her handwriting was careful and clear. Brennan signed after her, his own signature the cramped, slightly sideways thing it had always been. A man who'd learned to write late and alone. Callow stamped the page, blotted it, and looked up at them. "You want a copy of the certificate?" "Yes," Evelyn said. "Costs 50 cents. "That's fine." Callow made the copy, took the coins, and stood. "Well, good luck to you both." He seemed to mean it, which was more than Brennan had expected. They walked out into the cold street. The sky had gone flat and white, the kind of overcast that in Idaho in November meant you had maybe 2 hours before something came down out of it. Brennan looked at the sky, then at Evelyn. "We should get supplies while we're here," he said, "before the weather turns. I have a list." She reached into her coat pocket and produced a folded piece of paper. He looked at the list. It was thorough. Not extravagant, but thorough. Salt, flour, lard, dried beans, lamp oil, wire, 2 specific sizes of nails. She'd grouped them by where they'd likely be found in the general store. He handed it back to her. "You've done supply runs before," he said. "Since I was 12. My father ran the household accounts. He taught me." She folded the paper back. "Is that a problem?" "No, it's not a problem." They went to the general store. Brennan handled the heavier items. Evelyn negotiated the price on the lamp oil, which had been marked up since his last visit, and got it brought back down to a fair number by the simple act of pointing that out without any particular heat. The storekeeper, a thin man named Alt, who Brennan had always found moderately tolerable, watched this with something like appreciation. "You bring a wife to town, Vale?" Alt said, not unkindly. "Apparently," Brennan said. Alt laughed. Evelyn didn't react to being discussed in the third person, just finished tallying up the goods with a focused efficiency that made Alt look somewhat less certain of himself. On the ride back, with the pack horse loaded and the weather beginning to show its hand in a gray smear along the northern ridge, she said, "People in town are going to talk. People in town talk about everything. Water table goes down, they'll blame me for it." He paused. "You mind?" "Not particularly, but I want to know what story they have about you, so I know what I'm stepping into." It was a fair request. He'd have made it himself in her position. "Came here 12 years ago," he said. "Didn't talk to many people, which made them nervous. Had a dispute with a man named Fowler over water rights. He pushed it into a physical confrontation. I put him down hard enough that he needed a week in bed before he could sit a horse. Fowler talked after that. Told it however he needed to tell it to explain why a bigger man had ended up on his back." Brennan watched the trail ahead. "There have been other things. I had a bad few years before I came here. Some of that followed me. Some of it I deserved." "Did you kill anyone?" The question was direct. He respected that. "Not except in defense," he said, "and not around here." She absorbed this. "The man Fowler. What happened with the water rights?" "I won. He didn't push again." "Good." She adjusted her grip on the reins. Then the story was worth the trouble. He looked at her, surprised enough that he didn't bother hiding it. She wasn't looking at him, was watching the trail with the focused attention of someone who'd been riding long enough to never fully trust a horse on uncertain ground. "You're not what I expected," he said. "What did you expect?" "Scared, desperate. Somebody who'd fold the first time things got hard." "I'm scared," she said, matter of fact. "I've been scared since my father's letter, but scared doesn't mean helpless. My father taught me that too." The first flakes of snow came down just as they cleared the canyon mouth, light and dry, the kind that whispered instead of fell. By the time they got the horses put up and the supplies inside, it had thickened into a proper snowfall, coming down sideways with the wind now behind it. Brennan made a simple supper, salt pork and cornbread, and the last of some dried apple he'd been rationing. Evelyn ate without complaint and afterward helped clean up without being asked. Rex accepted her presence with more goodwill than he showed most visitors, which was either a good sign or proof that the dog was getting soft in his old age. They sat by the stove for a while after, not talking. It wasn't uncomfortable. It wasn't comfortable either. It was honest. Two people in the same space, neither pretending to be something they weren't. "I want to go over the books tomorrow," she said eventually. "The accounts, whatever records you have of the property." "Why?" "Because if we're doing this together, I need to understand what we're actually working with. The real numbers, not the hopeful ones." He studied her profile in the firelight. "You think I've been keeping hopeful numbers?" "I think most people do," she said. "It's easier than the alternative." He couldn't argue with that. "The ledger's on the second shelf," he said. "Behind the seed catalog. I'll warn you, it's not written with much clarity." "I'll manage." The snow came down all night. By morning it had put 6 inches on the ground and the world outside was white and still, the canyon walls rising stark and dark above it all. Brennan stood at the window before dawn with his first cup of coffee, a habit so old it didn't require thought anymore, and looked out at the changed landscape. He heard her door, then her step, lighter than his, crossing the main room, then the clink of the coffee pot. He didn't turn around. She didn't say anything. She just poured herself a cup and came to stand beside him at the window, and they both looked out at the snow. Rex lifted his head from his spot by the stove, looked at the two of them, and put his head back down. "It's beautiful," she said quietly, not trying to fill the silence, just noting it the way you'd note anything real. "It's also about 4 hours of clearing work," Brennan said. She almost smiled. He caught it at the corner of her mouth before it settled back into her usual expression. "Well," she said, "we'd better drink the coffee first." But the weeks that followed were hard in the way that early winter on a canyon homestead was always hard. Not dramatic, not sudden, but constant. The cold didn't announce itself. It just pressed in from every side and required relentless effort to hold back. Firewood, water, feed for the animals. The small daily arithmetic of survival. Brennan had done it alone for years. He was good at it, efficient, methodical, without wasted motion. But he'd also developed a single man's habits around it. The particular sequence of tasks, the specific way he weighted his day, the silences he'd built into the schedule that served no practical purpose except to give him room to exist without moving. Having another person in the space disrupted all of that in ways he hadn't anticipated. Evelyn was up before him 3 mornings out of 5, which bothered him more than it should have, not because he minded someone else getting up early, but because it made him feel like he was behind before the day had started. She reorganized the supply shelves on the second day, not dramatically, just logically, things grouped by use rather than by when he'd acquired them. And while he recognized immediately that her system made more sense, there was a week where he kept reaching for the wrong shelf out of habit and cursing under his breath. She heard him do it twice and very carefully did not say anything. They figured things out by trial and collision. The first real argument came about 10 days in over the question of the south pasture fence. "It needs to be repaired before the ground freezes solid," Evelyn said. They were at breakfast. "There are 3 posts that are loose and 1 section of wire that's going to fail." "I know about the fence," Brennan said. "You know about it, but you haven't fixed it." "I've been managing other priorities." "If a post works loose in a hard wind and the wire goes, we lose the fence and possibly the stock. That becomes a worse priority." He looked at her across the table. She was looking back at him with that steady, factual expression she had. Not aggressive, not backing down, just right, which was somehow more aggravating. "I'll fix the fence," he said. "I'll help." "You don't need to." 4 hands work faster than 2. "We'll lose the light by 3. Let's go after breakfast." She looked back at her plate. "Please." The please was slightly awkward, added on like she'd remembered partway through the sentence that they were still working out the grammar of speaking to each other. He noticed it. It made him feel slightly less like he was being managed. They fixed the fence. She held the posts while he drove them. She could read wire tension, which he hadn't expected, and caught a weakness in the line he'd missed. They finished with 40 minutes of daylight to spare, which she did not point out but he was aware of. Riding back to the cabin, he said, "Where'd you learn wire work?" "My father and I built 3 fences on different properties growing up," she said. "He always said a fence wasn't just about keeping things in. It was about knowing exactly where your line was." Brennan thought about that for a while. "He said good things." "He said right things," Evelyn said. "Not always the same." So, the community in the broader Canyon District, spread out across a dozen miles of rough country, knew about most things eventually, and they learned about Brennan's marriage the way they learned about most things, through the accumulated weight of small observations. Someone from Ridgepoint mentioned seeing them at the general store. Someone else saw the light in the cabin window in a pattern that suggested more than one person living there. The first neighbor who came by was a woman named Ada Holt, whose husband ran a small cattle operation about 8 miles east. She arrived one afternoon in early December with a covered dish and the specific energy of someone who'd been wanting to come for 2 weeks, but had made herself wait a decent interval. Brennan saw her coming from a distance and went out to meet her with the resigned air of a man who understood that some things couldn't be avoided. "Brought a venison pie," Ada said, in the particular tone of someone who has prepared a social transaction and is now executing it. She was in her mid-40s, weathered by the frontier in the way that didn't diminish her, but had stripped away everything except the essential. She looked past Brennan toward the cabin. "Heard you had company." "My wife," Brennan said. "Evelyn." Ada's eyebrows went up fractionally. She'd clearly heard something, but not the specific word wife. "Well," she said, and there was a whole collection of things in that single syllable. "All right, then." Evelyn came out from the cabin, having apparently seen the visitor from the window. She was carrying her jacket, putting it on as she walked. She'd been working inside and had the look of someone interrupted in the middle of something, which was accurate. "Mrs. Holt," Evelyn said, which meant she'd recognized the name from something. Possibly the ledger records, where Brennan had occasional notations about arrangements with neighboring operations. "Thank you for coming." Ada transferred her attention from Brennan to Evelyn with the complete efficiency of a woman who had always known that other women were more interesting than men at social gatherings. "You're Thomas Mercer's girl," she said, less as a question than as a fact she was confirming. "I am. I was sorry to hear about your father. Good man." Ada handed Evelyn the pie. "You settling in all right?" "It's been a process," Evelyn said honestly. "But yes." Ada looked at the cabin, then at the barn, then at the fence line that ran along the east side, the one they'd just repaired. "Place looks better maintained than last time I came by," she said. This was aimed approximately at Brennan. "Mrs. Vale's been reorganizing things," Brennan said, because it was true, and because the look on Ada Holt's face suggested she'd appreciate accuracy. Ada looked at Evelyn again. There was an assessment happening. A frontier woman measuring another frontier woman, in the specific way that had nothing to do with the niceties of parlor society and everything to do with whether this person could actually survive. Whatever Ada Holt concluded, she apparently resolved it in Evelyn's favor. "You come find me if you need anything," she said. "I mean that. Tom Holt and I are 8 miles east, but 8 miles is nothing when the need's real." She looked at Brennan. "You hear me?" "I hear you, Ada." "Good." She turned back to her horse. "Pie's better warm." After she left, they stood on the porch for a moment. The air had a bite in it that promised more snow by nightfall. "She's going to tell everyone," Brennan said. "Yes," Evelyn agreed. "Was that a problem?" He thought about it. "No. Probably better than the alternative. People imagining things is worse than people knowing things." She looked at him. "That's actually wise." "Don't sound so surprised." She pressed her lips together against what might have been a smile. "I'll try." They went inside. She served the venison pie for supper. It was, in fact, better warm. It was during the 3rd week of December, going through the ledger by lantern light after supper, that Evelyn said, "You have a water source issue." Brennan looked up from the piece of harness he was mending. "Meaning the creek that runs through the lower canyon, Cutter Creek. It feeds your stock water and irrigates the south fields." "Which you know. But I've been looking at the survey notes in here and the older correspondence, and your property controls the point where Cutter Creek narrows before it spreads out onto the lower valley, which means anyone downstream from you is dependent on your land for reliable water access." "I know that. Has anyone ever made you an offer on the land?" He was quiet for a moment. "Once or twice." Evelyn set down her pen. "Recently?" "About a year back. Woman named Veronica Hale. Runs the biggest cattle operation in the territory, Hale Ranch, South Valley. Sends her men up to the lower valley twice a year or more to use the creek access." "She made you an offer." "She made me an offer." He turned the harness over in his hands. "I declined." "How did she take that?" He considered the question with more care than it might have seemed to warrant. "She took it politely enough in the moment. She's not someone who shows her hand when she's losing." He paused. "Why are you asking?" Evelyn tapped the ledger page. "Because the survey notes in here describe your water position in enough detail that anyone who read them would understand immediately what your land controls. And if someone wanted that access and couldn't buy it, they'd look for another way." "I just want to understand all of it," she said. "Not to worry about it necessarily, just to understand the full picture." Brennan looked at her across the room. The lantern light made everything amber, softened the angles of her face. She wasn't being dramatic about any of this. She was being methodical, analytical. the same way she'd approached the fence work, the supply list, the reorganized shelves. She was building a complete picture, piece by piece, quietly, because that was how she worked. The full picture is that Veronica Hale is a wealthy and patient woman who doesn't like being told no, he said, and she has more resources than we do. That's usually true of opponents worth worrying about, Evelyn said. She picked her pen back up. Does she know you married? Word gets around? I imagine she's heard by now. She wrote something in the margin of the ledger. Not nervously, deliberately. Good. Good? It changes the picture for her, Evelyn said. A man alone on a struggling homestead is one kind of problem to solve. A man with a capable partner is a different kind. She looked up. It doesn't make us safer, but it changes what she has to account for. Brennan watched her go back to the numbers. Outside, the wind was coming up again, that low moan through the canyon walls that he knew so well. Rex shifted in his sleep. The fire held. He thought about Thomas Mercer writing that letter in the morning before he died, about what it must have cost to write it, not the effort of the words, but the admission embedded in them, that this was all he had left to give his daughter, a name and a trust, and a hope that the man on the other end of it would be worth both. He thought about the mind thermometer on the exterior wall, given by a man now gone. He thought about the fact that the empty chair across from him had been empty for 12 years, and for the first time in all of that, he wasn't entirely sure he minded that it wasn't empty anymore. He didn't examine that thought too closely. He set it aside and went back to the harness. Some things, he'd learned, were better approached in their own time. The last days of December came with the particular quiet of deep winter. The world contracted, the sky lowered, the canyon sank into itself. Brennan and Evelyn settled into the rhythms of the place, not without difficulty, but with the steady incremental adjustment of two people who had each, in their different ways, learned how to survive things. She learned where the worst drafts came from and blocked them with strips of cloth she found in a trunk, which dropped the interior temperature drop enough at night to matter. He learned that she needed 20 minutes of silence in the mornings before she was ready to talk, and he stopped trying to discuss things before the second cup of coffee. She learned that his temper, when it came, moved fast and sharp, and then was done. Not a slow burn, but a sudden storm that blew itself out. He learned that hers was the opposite, slow to arrive, colder, and considerably more precise. He learned that she occasionally woke in the night, and he'd hear her moving quietly in her room, restless. He'd lie awake and listen and wonder if she was thinking about her father, or the debts, or the life she'd expected to have versus the one she'd ended up in. He didn't ask. It wasn't the kind of thing you asked, but he left the lamp oil where she could find it easily, so she could read if she wanted to, and he never commented on the light under her door. It was a small thing. It was one of the few things he knew how to offer. The year turned. January came in hard, and Brennan Vale, who had lived alone in a canyon for 12 years and told himself he was fine with it, found that the sound of another person breathing in the same house was something he hadn't known he was missing until it was there. He didn't know what to do with that yet, but for once, he didn't push it away. January in the canyon was a different country entirely. Brennan had lived through 11 winters here and understood that the cold in January wasn't the same cold as November or December. November cold was an announcement. December cold was a settling in. January cold was a decision, the kind that didn't negotiate, didn't soften, didn't apologize. It came down out of the northern passes and pressed itself against everything like a hand against a throat, and the only response that worked was to stop fighting it and just outlast it. He'd explained this to Evelyn once, approximately. She'd listened, nodded, and gone back to what she was doing. 3 days later, when the temperature dropped to 4 below and the water in the kitchen bucket froze overnight despite the stove running, she didn't complain about it. She broke the ice with the handle of a ladle, put the bucket closer to the stove, and made a note in the margin of the household account book about adjusting the firewood burn rate for extreme cold nights. That was something he was still getting used to. The notes. She wrote things down constantly, not in an anxious, fearful way, but in the way of someone who understood that memory was unreliable, and that the difference between getting through a hard winter and not getting through it was often the gap between what you thought you had and what you actually had. Her handwriting filled the margins of the account book, crept into the back pages of the seed catalog, appeared on small, folded squares of paper that materialized in specific locations. A measurement note tucked behind the flour bin, a calculation pin near the stove about the rate of lamp oil consumption. He'd found one in his coat pocket. He still wasn't sure when she'd put it there. It was a note about the East Pasture water pipe, a freeze risk she'd identified from looking at the slope of the ground and the direction of the prevailing wind. She'd been right about the pipe. He'd insulated it the afternoon he found the note, and it held through the worst of January without splitting. He'd meant to say something to her about it. He kept not finding the right words, which was a problem he'd had his whole life with things that mattered and no problem at all with things that didn't. She didn't bring it up either. The pipe held. That was probably enough. Rex had decided, without any ceremony, that Evelyn was part of his household. The dog divided his sleeping locations now. Half his nights by the stove, half stretched across the doorway of her room in a posture of dedicated inconvenience. Twice she'd nearly tripped over him, getting up in the dark. The first time she'd muttered something under her breath and stepped over him. The second time Brennan had heard her say, quietly and without particular anger, "Rex, move." A pause. Then the sound of the dog repositioning. He'd smiled at the ceiling of his own room and felt slightly guilty about it. The work of the homestead in January was relentless and mostly unglamorous. There were fences to check after windstorms, stock to feed twice daily, regardless of what the weather was doing, water to haul when pipes ran slow, repairs to make on equipment that had been waiting since autumn for attention. Brennan had always approached this work with a grim, efficient competence. He did it because it needed doing. He found no particular satisfaction in it. What surprised him was watching Evelyn find satisfaction in it, not in everything. She was honest enough that she didn't pretend the water hauling was enjoyable or that mending harness in cold fingers was anything other than tedious. But there was a specific quality she had when a thing she'd been working on came right. A faint change in her posture, a brief stillness before she moved on to the next task. He caught it when she successfully grafted a repair on a cracked wagon wheel spoke, using a technique she'd read about in a handbook and worked out by trial over 3 days. He caught it when she balanced the account book for the first time, and the numbers came out to something marginally less alarming than expected. "We're not in as bad a position as I thought," she said one evening, looking at the ledger. Brennan looked up from across the room. "Define bad." "The cattle sale last spring was better than the ledger suggests because you haven't posted the full credit from Alt's store account." She turned the book toward him, pointing to 2 separate columns. "When you add this to this, the actual shortfall is here, not here, which is manageable." He looked at the numbers. He'd been looking at those numbers for 2 years with a low-grade anxiety he'd learned to mostly ignore. The number she was pointing at was smaller, not comfortable, but survivable. "You're certain? I've checked it 4 times. She closed the book. "We need a better year on cattle this spring, and the south field needs to produce. The soil's decent, but it's been underplanted. I want to put in a larger kitchen garden and expand the bean crop. Beans will sell or feed us, either way." "That's a lot of additional planting." "I know, I'll do it." She said it without bravado, just fact. "I'll help with the planting." She looked at him, slightly surprised. "I wasn't asking you to." "I know you weren't." He went back to what he was doing. "We'll do it faster together." A short silence, then, "All right." That was most of their conversations. Practical, slightly careful, both of them feeling out the edges of how to be 2 people in a shared space without colliding more than necessary. There were collisions anyway, moments of friction that came from nothing more complicated than the fact that people were different and living close made differences visible. She thought he was too slow to make decisions about some things. He thought she moved too fast on others. She'd grown up in a household that talked through problems out loud. He'd developed the habit of sitting with a problem in silence until it resolved itself, or until he'd run out of patience with it. One morning in late January, he came in from morning chores to find her standing in the middle of the main room with her hands on her hips, looking at the wall beside the stove. "What?" he said. "The shelf," she said. "It's angled wrong. The jars are going to slide off in a hard enough wind." He looked at the shelf. It was a shelf he'd built 6 years ago. He'd noticed the angle himself maybe 4 years ago and hadn't done anything about it because the jars had never actually fallen. "They haven't fallen yet," he said. "They will," she said. "Eventually." Evelyn. Brennan. He looked at her. She looked at him. There was a specific quality to the silence, not angry exactly, but loaded. "It'll take 20 minutes to reset," she said. "I measured." "Of course you measured." "One of us has to." He took his coat back off and fixed the shelf. She held the level. When it was done, and the jars were reset and everything was exactly as it had been, except correctly angled, neither of them said anything about it. They had lunch. He went back out to work. That evening, setting his cup down on the table, he noticed that the thing no longer bothered him the way it should have. The shelf being fixed. Her having been right about it. He sat with that for a while, puzzled by himself. The truth he was slowly working toward, without quite arriving at it yet, was that her competence wasn't a challenge to him. He'd expected it to feel like one. Expected the old resistance that flared whenever he'd had someone in his space before. That instinct to protect the particular silence of a life arranged exactly to his own preferences. But she wasn't trying to reshape the life. She was just trying to make it work. There was a difference, and he was beginning to understand it. It was easier to understand when he stopped comparing her to some idea of what a wife was supposed to be, and started just looking at who she actually was. She was someone who woke up tired sometimes and worked anyway. Someone who missed her father. He could see it occasionally, in the evenings especially, when she'd go quiet in a way that was different from her usual quiet. Someone who'd learned to be self-sufficient young and had a complicated relationship with asking for help. Which meant that when she did ask for something, it was because she genuinely needed it, and he'd learned to pay attention to those moments. She was someone who, it turned out, found the canyon beautiful in a way that wasn't sentimental or performed. He'd catch her sometimes at the window or pausing in the yard, looking at the walls of the canyon in the particular light of late afternoon when the stone went amber and the creek below caught it and threw it back. She never said anything about it. She just looked, and then went back to whatever she'd been doing. He understood that. He'd never said anything about it either. February arrived, and with it a change in the homestead situation that neither of them had anticipated. The change came in the form of Ada Holt, who rode up on a Tuesday afternoon with an expression that meant she had something to say and had been waiting to say it. "I'm going to tell you something that you're going to hear anyway," Ada said, standing in the main room with her coat still on, which meant this was a short visit of purpose rather than a social call. "Veronica Hale's been talking." Evelyn set down her pen. Brennan, who had been working on the saddle rack near the back wall, went still. "Talking how?" Evelyn asked. "Talking about this place, about the marriage." Ada looked between them. "She's telling people the marriage isn't legitimate, that it was arranged for property purposes and should be examined. She's got a lawyer from the county seat asking questions about the Ridgepoint registry." Brennan's jaw tightened. "That's no one's business." "It's not," Ada said bluntly. "But Hale makes it her business when she wants something, and she wants this land. Everyone who's been paying attention knows it." She paused. "I want you to know because I like you both, and because I think you need to understand what you're dealing with." After Ada left, the cabin was quiet for a long moment. "She's going to keep pushing," Evelyn said. She wasn't alarmed. She was thinking, "Yes, and the water rights are the reason. That's the center of all of it." She opened the ledger to the back page where she'd been accumulating notes on the property's history. "We need to make sure every piece of our documentation is airtight. Every record, every filing, everything." "You think she'll try to go legal?" "She's already trying legal. She's also trying social." Evelyn looked up. "She's smart. She knows that if she can make people doubt the legitimacy of this marriage, it creates uncertainty about the property claim, which gives her ground to work with." She paused. "She's not going to come at this directly. She's going to erode it from the sides." Brennan looked at her. "You sound like you've thought about this kind of thing before." "My father had a land dispute when I was 17. Different circumstances, but the same playbook. A powerful person who wants what you have and can't take it cleanly, so they make the ground unstable instead." She tapped the pen against the page. "He won, but it took 2 years and cost him money he couldn't really afford, and the relationship damage in the community took longer." "How did he win?" "Documentation, community trust, and patience." She set the pen down. "The documentation we can control. The community trust we've been building since Ada Holt came with her pie." Something hardened in her expression, not with anger, but with the specific quality of a person who had decided. "The patience I can manage." Brennan sat down across from her. You're not going to tell me you're afraid. I didn't say I wasn't afraid. She met his eyes. I said I can manage it. He nodded slowly. Outside, the wind moved through the canyon with its particular sound, that low, sustained note that in months of living here had become as familiar to him as breathing. He'd heard it alone for years. He was aware, sitting here now, that it sounded different with someone else in the room. Not better necessarily, just different, inhabited. We'll go through everything, he said. Every document, every record. You tell me what we need and I'll tell you where to find it. Starting tomorrow, Evelyn said. Starting tomorrow. She picked her pen back up and made a note. He watched her write, thought about Thomas Mercer writing his own letter in the morning before he died, thought about chains of trust and how they pass between people. The thought was more than he usually let himself have, and he set it aside before it became something he had to do something about. The days lengthened. February moved into the back half of itself, and then March came. And with March came the first signs that the world was not going to stay frozen forever, though it was not generous about it. The snow retreated in patches, exposing ground that was still iron-hard beneath and muddy at the surface. The worst kind of working conditions, the kind where nothing was reliable underfoot and everything took longer. But the creek ran faster. The light lasted a little longer each evening. Rex spent more time outside, which meant he'd smelled something worth tracking, and the world had become interesting to him again after months of cold. Evelyn started planning the expanded planning in detail. She had drawn a layout of the South Field on paper, divided into sections, with a rotation schedule that Brennan privately thought was possibly too optimistic, but that he also recognized was grounded in actual knowledge of soil and yield. She had seeds she'd sourced carefully through the winter, writing letters to 2 different suppliers and negotiating delivery costs. She'd talked the Holts into a seed-sharing arrangement on beans, her variety for Tom Holt's variety, which would give both operations broader stock than either could afford alone. When did you arrange that? Brennan asked, when she mentioned it. When Ada came by in February, after you went back to work. She looked at him. I should have told you sooner. I'm used to making decisions and then reporting them. So am I, he said. I imagine that's something we're going to keep bumping into. Probably. She was looking at the field plan. Do you disagree with the arrangement? No, it's a good arrangement. He paused. Next time tell me before. All right. She marked something on the plan. Same to you. He had the specific sensation of a person who had just agreed to something that would require genuine effort from him. He didn't quite know what to do with that, except acknowledge it internally and move on. One evening in mid-March, as the temperature finally crept above freezing at midday and the canyon dripped and ran, Evelyn found him standing at the edge of the South Field looking at the ground. She came and stood beside him. What are you thinking? She asked. That it's going to be a hard year no matter what we do, he said. The winters cost us. The cattle need better grass than last summer gave them. The garden will help, but it's not going to fix everything. No, she agreed. It's not. I'm not saying we can't get through it. I know. She looked at the field, then at the canyon walls rising above them. The afternoon light was doing the amber thing, as it always did at this hour, and for a moment neither of them said anything. My father used to say that surviving a hard year together was worth more than 10 easy ones, she said finally, because you find out what you're actually made of. Your father said a lot of things. He had a lot of time to think them up. There was a small catch in her voice, just small. She didn't try to hide it or push past it too quickly, just let it be there for a moment. Brennan had never been good at the words that went in these moments. He was better with the absence of the wrong words. He stayed where he was, didn't move away, didn't fill the air with anything, just stood there beside her while she let the moment exist. After a while, she took a slow breath and looked at the field again. The bean section needs to go in the far corner, she said. Better drainage. I thought the same. They stood there a little while longer, looking at the ground that would need to become something, and then walked back to the cabin together as the last of the afternoon light went off the canyon walls and the cold crept back in behind it. The trouble with Veronica Hale announced itself more concretely in the last week of March, when a man Brennan didn't recognize rode up the trail on a large bay horse and identified himself as an agent of Hale Ranch. He was polite in the way that people are polite when they're delivering unpleasant things and want to maintain the fiction of civility. He had papers. He laid them on the table, Brennan and Evelyn both standing, neither sitting, which was deliberate, and explained in measured terms that Hale Ranch was initiating a formal dispute over the southern boundary of the Vale property, claiming that a survey discrepancy placed approximately 40 acres, including the creek narrows, outside the original homestead claim. He finished speaking. The room was quiet. "That's not accurate," Evelyn said. The man looked at her with the slight recalibration that men sometimes had to make when a woman spoke with flat authority about legal matters. "Ma'am, the survey you're referencing is from 1877, she said. There was a corrected survey in 1879, which supersedes it. I have the documentation." She paused. "Do you have the documentation from 1879? The man looked at his papers. "I wasn't provided." "I didn't think so." She looked at the papers on the table without touching them. "You can leave these. I'll review them against our records and respond through the appropriate channel." She looked at him directly. "We won't be signing anything today." The man left without getting what he came for, which Brennan suspected was a reaction they could use, a signature, a statement, something to build from. He watched the bay horse disappear down the trail and then looked at Evelyn. "You knew about the 1879 survey," he said. "I found it in the back of the land deed folder 2 months ago. I wasn't sure it was relevant until today." She picked up the papers the man had left and began reading them with the focused attention she gave to anything she considered a genuine threat. "It's very relevant. You didn't mention it. I wrote it in the ledger margin." She glanced up. "I'll tell you next time." He should have been annoyed. He found he wasn't, quite. She'd found the thing that protected them before either of them knew they needed it. He could be particular about the reporting later. "What do they actually want?" he asked. "The creek narrows. Control the narrows, you control the downstream water access for the whole South Valley. Hale's cattle operation needs that water, or they need to pay for access rights." She set the papers down. "Right now they use your land informally because you've tolerated it. If they can establish a boundary dispute, they cloud your title, and a clouded title can be challenged, sold under, or tied up in territorial court for years. And while it's in court, everything you have is uncertain. Banks won't extend credit on uncertain title. You can't sell if you needed to, and a wealthy opponent can keep a case moving slowly for as long as they want." She looked at him. "It's a slow suffocation." Brennan was quiet for a long moment. He looked at his hands, the old scars on the knuckles, the crooked fourth finger on his left hand. He'd faced things that threatened him before, things that came at you fast and ugly and required an immediate response. This was different. This was something that came at you sideways, through paperwork and legal language and social pressure and the slow grinding erosion of uncertainty. He hated it more than the fast kind, but he understood from her expression that the response was the same. You stood your ground, you used what you had, and you didn't fold. "Tell me what we need to do," he said. Evelyn looked at him for a moment, not checking to see if he meant it, because she'd been paying attention since November and knew by now when he was serious. She was just taking a breath. "We need to get copies of everything to a lawyer we trust. Not Hale's lawyer, not a county lawyer she can influence. Someone in Boise, outside her network." She picked up her pen. "And we need to talk to every neighbor who uses Cutter Creek and explain to them what's actually at stake. Because if Hale gets control of that narrows, it's not just our problem, it's theirs too. They may not want to get involved. Some of them won't." She began writing. "But some of them will. Because the ones who've been here long enough understand that what happens to one water claim on this creek is a precedent for all of them." She paused. "Ada Holt's husband has grazing rights on the lower creek. He'll understand." Brennan pulled the second chair to the table and sat down. Rex lifted his head from the doorway and looked at both of them, then went back to sleep. "All right," Brennan said. "Let's start." They worked at the table until the lamp needed refilling and well past the point where they should have stopped for supper, and outside the canyon settled into its nighttime sounds, the creek, the wind, the occasional call of something in the dark. Two people sitting at a scarred table with their papers spread between them, trying to hold on to what they'd built. It was not a comfortable thing, it was an honest one, and neither of them had ever asked for comfortable anyway. The letter from the Boise lawyer arrived in the second week of April, and it said what Evelyn had hoped it would say. The 1879 survey was legally binding. The boundary dispute had no legitimate foundation, and Hale Ranch's claim would not survive a territorial court challenge if properly contested. The lawyer's name was Aldrich, and he was expensive in the way that competent people in distant cities tend to be. But his letter was clear and his reasoning was sound, and Evelyn read it 3 times at the table while Brennan stood near the window waiting. "He says we're on solid ground," she said. "Good. He also says that solid ground doesn't stop someone from making the next 12 months miserable while they test it." "Also good to know." Brennan turned from the window. "So we write back, retain him, and send him the full documentation package." "Yes." She folded the letter. "And we keep doing what we've been doing, the neighbors. Tom Holt came around on Tuesday while you were working the north fence. He's willing to make a statement about the creek access history if it comes to that. He said 2 others on the lower stretch might be willing too." "Who?" "Cartwright and the Brenshaw family." Brennan nodded slowly. He knew Cartwright by reputation. A careful man, not one to get involved in other people's disputes without reason. The fact that he was considering it meant Evelyn had framed the situation in terms that landed correctly. "You talked to Cartwright yourself?" he asked. "Tom brought him by. I made coffee." She set the letter in the documentation folder she'd been building since March, a system that by now was organized enough that she could put her hand on any specific record in under 2 minutes. "He asked a lot of questions. I answered them honestly, including the parts that weren't flattering to our situation. That's usually the right move with careful people." "I know." She looked up. "He said he'd think about it, which, from what Tom tells me, means he probably will." Brennan sat down across from her. The morning light came through the south window at a lower angle now than in winter. The season was turning, slowly, as it always did in the canyon, the light changing before anything else did. Outside, the planting was underway. They'd broken ground on the expanded south field the week before. Harder work than anticipated because the winter had compacted the soil badly in the lower section, and they'd had to go over it twice with the plow before it was workable. His back had been complaining about it for days. He didn't mention the back. It would improve or it wouldn't, and either way the work still needed doing. "Hale's going to do something else," he said. "Yes." Evelyn said it without drama, the way she said most things that were unpleasant but true. The survey dispute was too clean. When it doesn't work, she'll try something messier. "What kind of messier?" "I don't know yet." She opened the ledger. But the pattern with this kind of campaign is escalation. You start with the thing that might work without cost, and when it doesn't, you move to the thing that costs something but inflicts more damage. She paused. "We should be prepared. We're prepared. We should be more prepared." He looked at her. There was something behind the measured tone that he'd learned to read over these months. Not fear exactly, but a heightened alertness. The posture of someone whose instincts were telling them something their evidence hadn't caught up to yet. "What are you not saying?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. "One of Hale's ranch hands came through Ridge Point last week. Alt mentioned it when I was in for supplies. The man was asking questions about us, about the property, about who comes and goes." She met Brennan's eyes. "That's reconnaissance." "Alt told you this?" "Alt tells me things because I ask him directly, and I don't make him feel like he's getting anyone in trouble. He's a practical man. He doesn't like Hale because she buys her bulk supplies from a depot in the South Valley and only comes to him when she needs something specific. He has no loyalty to her and a moderate amount of goodwill toward us." Brennan absorbed this. He thought about the ranch hand asking questions in Ridge Point. He thought about Veronica Hale sitting in whatever comfortable office she maintained and evaluating what she knew about this homestead, this water source, these 2 people who kept refusing to be moved. "She's going to hit us somewhere we're exposed," he said. "Yes." "The barn." Evelyn looked at him sharply. "Why the barn?" "Because it's the most exposed structure. It's set back from the cabin, it's where the feed is stored, and losing it would hurt us more than losing anything else except the water. It would set us back a full season at minimum." He paused, "and it would be hard to prove who did it." She was very still for a moment, thinking. Then she got up and went to the window that faced the barn. The structure was solid. He'd rebuilt 2 walls of it the previous summer, but solid didn't mean fireproof, and the interior was full of hay and dry wood and everything that burned easily. "We should vary the night schedule," she said quietly. Not every night, but often enough that there's no reliable window when no one's checking. I was thinking the same. Rex sleeps light. Rex is 11 years old and sleeps through storms now. She turned from the window. I'll take some nights. You don't have to... Brennan. She said it with a patience that was slightly frayed at the edges. We have established that this is a shared situation. Stop trying to put walls around the parts you think are your job. He didn't answer immediately. The instinct to do exactly that, to place himself between a threat and the person he'd taken responsibility for, was so old it felt like bone. He'd been managing it since November, with uneven success. All right, he said finally. We'll share the nights. She nodded and sat back down. They went back to work. But that evening, moving the lantern before bed, he paused at the window and stood there for a while looking at the barn in the dark. The canyon was quiet in the way it was quiet at midnight. Complete, almost pressing. The creek below made its low sound. There was no wind. Everything looked the way it always looked. He went to bed but didn't sleep well, and he didn't examine why. The fire came on a Thursday night in the last week of April, when the temperature had climbed enough that he'd cut back the stove before sleeping. He'd checked the barn at 11. Everything had been as it should be. Horses calm, hay dry, the smell of the place the familiar combination of animal and dust and old wood. At 2 in the morning, Rex woke him. The dog wasn't barking. Rex, old and with diminished hearing, did something worse. He let out a single low whine that was so unlike his usual sounds that Brennan was on his feet before he was fully awake, his body responding to the alarm before his mind had caught up with it. He smelled it before he saw it. Smoke, carrying differently than wood smoke from a stove, sharper, with something underneath it that was the specific smell of hay burning. He hit the door at a run. The back corner of this barn was on fire. Not the roof, not yet, but the corner nearest the hay storage, and the fire had been going long enough that the wallboards had caught and the interior glow was visible through the gaps in the siding. The horses were aware of it. He could hear them from here, their movement frantic and rhythmic against the stall boards. He was halfway across the yard when Evelyn came out of the cabin behind him. She'd heard Rex, or heard him move. She was in her coat over her nightclothes, her boots not fully laced. Get the horses out first, she said, running. She said it clearly, without panic, and it was the right call, and he was already moving toward the barn door. The horses came out badly. Brennan's gelding nearly took him down in the doorway, terrified and scrambling, and the roan mare was worse, nearly unmanageable, until Evelyn appeared beside him and got her hands on the bridle with a controlled firmness that got the animal moving in the right direction. They got all 4 horses out, and Evelyn ran them to the east fence and tied them with quick hitches that would hold without hurting them if they pulled. Then they fought the fire. They had a water barrel at the north end of the barn. He'd positioned it there years ago for this exact purpose. And 2 buckets, and what they were doing was nowhere near sufficient for what the fire wanted to do, but it was what they had, and they worked it in a rhythm that came from nowhere, except the urgency of the moment. He filled, she threw, she filled, he threw. The corner fire fought them. The wallboards had really caught now, and the heat coming off them was significant, pushing them back, making every approach cost something. They lost the corner. That section of wall came down eventually, in a controlled collapse that sent a shower of sparks outward and sideways that they both shielded from. But the collapse also took away the fire's reach toward the interior of the barn, and with the horses out and the main feed storage on the opposite end, what they were left with was a significant structural loss, and the scorched but intact body of the barn itself. By 4 in the morning, the fire was out. The east wall and the back corner were gone. The floor along that section was burned through. Structurally, the remaining 3 walls were compromised but standing. They stood in the yard in the dark, and the smell of wet ash, and looked at it. Evelyn's hands were red. She'd gotten too close at one point, and the heat had found the backs of her hands. Not burned through, but raw. She was holding them slightly away from her sides, and Brennan noticed and felt something sharp and unpleasant move through his chest. "Let me see," he said. She held out her hands. He turned them over carefully. The skin was reddened and tender but intact. A heat scorch, not a true burn. It would hurt for days. "It's fine," she said. "It's not fine, but it'll heal." He released her hands. "Come inside, there's salve." "We need to check the structure first, Evelyn." He said it quietly, but with enough weight that she stopped. The structure will be there in 10 minutes. Come inside. She looked at him. Something moved across her face. Not quite surprise, not quite relief. She was tired and shaken in the way that came after adrenaline left. The specific hollowness of a body that had been running on urgency for 2 hours and had run out of it. All right, she said. Inside he found the salve. A tin of it he kept for livestock injuries that worked equally well on human skin. And she sat at the table with her hands on the surface while he applied it. She didn't make a sound. Her jaw was set. It wasn't an accident, she said. No, the corner it started in. That corner has no lamp, no heat source, nothing that would naturally ignite. She was working through it even now, even with her hands hurting, because that was how her mind worked, and he'd stopped being surprised by it months ago. Someone set it, probably with something fast, oil-soaked material maybe, placed where the hay was closest to the wall. That's what I think too. They waited until the coldest hour, when people sleep deepest. She paused. If Rex hadn't... He did, Brennan said. She went quiet. He finished with the salve and found a strip of clean cloth to wrap the worst of it loosely, more to keep the salve in place than anything else. His hands were steadier than they had any right to be. A quality he'd developed in worse situations than this, the ability to keep his hands working while the rest of him was doing something else entirely. The rest of him was doing something that sat between fury and a very cold clarity. She made a mistake, Evelyn said. He looked at her. How so? She sent someone to do something illegal, which means there's a person who did it, and that person made choices, and choices leave evidence. She flexed her fingers carefully. We didn't run. We didn't fold. We put the fire out. Something settled in her expression, the look he'd come to recognize as the point at which she'd decided something. She was hoping to break us. She doesn't know us. Brennan said nothing for a moment. He looked at the bandaged hands, then at her face, the tiredness in it, the ash still on her cheek, the steadiness in her eyes that nothing about the last 2 hours had shaken. He thought about 11 days of silence before she arrived, about not knowing he was missing the sound of another person breathing in the same house. No, he agreed. She doesn't. At first light, he went back to the barn with a systematic eye, not as a man assessing damage, but as a man looking for evidence. He moved slowly along the burned section, examining what was left of the floor, the base of the exterior wall, the ground outside along the base. Evelyn came out 20 minutes later, her hands wrapped, moving carefully. There, she said, pointing. He'd been looking at the wrong place. She was pointing to the exterior base of the east wall, 10 feet from the burned corner, a small darkened patch on the ground that the fire hadn't fully consumed, and within it, the unmistakable edge of charred burlap. Someone had placed a bundle of oil-soaked burlap at the base of the exterior wall and lit it. The fire had caught the lower wallboards and worked inward from there. The placement was deliberate, angled toward the hay storage, positioned where the fire would have the longest reach before anyone noticed. They know the barn, Brennan said quietly, or someone described it to them. She crouched carefully, without using her hands, and looked at the ground around the charred patch. There's boot prints. Partial. The soil was soft from the last rain. She looked up. We need to preserve this. You want to go to the law? I want to go to the territorial marshal's office, she said. Not the county sheriff. County sheriff is too close to the valley politics. Too many ways Hale's money reaches there. She stood. The territorial marshal has to respond to documented arson. It's not optional for them. And if we walk in with physical evidence, the burlap, the boot print, a documented account from both of us, they have to open an inquiry. Brennan looked at the evidence, then at Evelyn. She has more influence than we do. She does. Evelyn's voice was level. But we have something she doesn't. What? The truth. She said it simply, without theater, and I know how to document it. They spent the morning carefully preserving what they had. Evelyn directed, she knew how things needed to be recorded to be legally useful, and she was careful and methodical about it in a way that cost her. He could see, because the hand movement was painful, and she was doing it anyway. He helped where he could, and where she needed him to take over, she directed him precisely enough that the result was what it needed to be. They had the burlap fragment, wrapped in clean cloth. They had a detailed written account of the fire's origin and behavior, signed by both of them. They had a crude but accurate sketch of the boot print that Evelyn had made before the morning dew disturbed the impression further. And they had Rex, who Brennan had watched carefully in the early morning light, noting that the dog's behavior near the east side of the barn was different from his behavior near the fire damage, more agitated, more interested, in the way that meant a scent he recognized. Someone he smelled before, Brennan said. Evelyn looked at the dog. Hale's man who came with the papers. In March. Rex was in the yard. He would have filed it. She said it the way she said things she was confident about. No emphasis, just fact. Dogs do that, especially old dogs. They remember threat. He looked at Rex, who was pacing the east wall with his nose down. That's not evidence a court can use. Oh, no. But it tells us we're right. She watched the dog. It tells us who sent him. 2 days after the fire, they rode for the territorial marshal's office. It was a full day's ride, and they went together. Brennan had considered going alone and dismissed the idea, both because it was her evidence as much as his, and because he understood, after months of watching how her mind worked, that she would handle the conversation with an authority and precision that he genuinely might not. He wasn't comfortable admitting that. He admitted it anyway, internally, which was as far as he generally got with uncomfortable self-awareness. The territorial marshal's office was in a larger settlement called Harwick, bigger than Ridgepoint, with the faint pretension of a town that was trying to be something more permanent than the frontier usually allowed. The marshal himself was a lean, gray-haired man named Sewell, who'd been in the position long enough that very little surprised him, and most things annoyed him slightly. He listened to their account without interrupting. He examined the burlap fragment and the sketch of the boot print. He read the written account with a careful eye. Then he set it all down on his desk and looked at both of them. You're making a serious allegation, he said, against a serious person. We're making a documented allegation, Evelyn said, about a serious crime. Sewell looked at her. She returned the look without flinching. Brennan sat beside her and let her carry it, which was a thing he'd been practicing. The restraint of not filling space that didn't need him in it. Hale Ranch has significant presence in the territory, Sewell said. The law has more presence than any ranch, Evelyn said. If it doesn't, we should all know that clearly, so we can make decisions accordingly. Sewell was quiet for a moment. He was reading her, Brennan could see, the way experienced men in official positions read people who walk into their offices claiming things, looking for the gap between what the person said and what they were. He apparently didn't find one. I'll send a deputy to examine the site, he said, within the week. Don't disturb the physical evidence further. He picked up the written account. And I'll want statements from any witnesses to Hale Ranch activity near your property in the weeks prior. We have those, Evelyn said. She produced 3 folded pages from her coat, statements she'd gathered from Tom Holt and Cartwright, carefully written, with specific dates and observations. These are sworn and signed. Sewell took the pages with the expression of a man who was moderately impressed but had decided not to show it too directly. You came prepared. We had 2 days, she said. We used them. On the ride home, the day cooling around them as they moved back into the canyon country, Brennan rode beside her for a long while without speaking. The landscape opened and closed as the trail wound through the rock cuts, the canyon light doing its late afternoon amber. The horses were tired but steady. You were right about him, Brennan said eventually. I thought he'd be fair. He looked like someone who'd stayed in the position because he believed in it, not because it paid well. She adjusted her grip on the reins with her wrapped hands, careful but competent. He'll send the deputy. And if Hale gets ahead of it somehow, gets to Sewell first, then we'll know the extent of her reach and we'll take it higher. She glanced at him. There is always somewhere higher. It takes longer, but it exists. He nodded. He'd never been a person who thought in those terms. Always somewhere higher, always another level of recourse. He'd grown up in a world where if the person above you was corrupt, you either dealt with it yourself or you left. She'd grown up watching her father navigate the same frontier by a different method, not by fighting authority, but by using it correctly, by understanding that systems, however flawed, had mechanisms, and that those mechanisms could be made to work if you were persistent and precise enough. Thomas Mercer, teaching his daughter, to read the world. Ada Holt's going to want to know what happened, Brennan said. I'll tell her tomorrow. She'll tell everyone who needs to know within 48 hours. Evelyn paused. The community knowing is part of the protection. Hale works best in the dark. This puts light on it. You think like a strategist. She was quiet for a moment. I think like a woman who's had to be careful about everything her whole life, she said. It's not the same as strategy. It just looks like it from the outside. He turned that over. He supposed she was right. The distinction mattered. They came down the last stretch of the South Trail as the last light left the canyon walls. The homestead came into view, cabin intact, the horses at the east fence still calm, and the barn with its damaged east end a stark reminder of what had been survived 2 nights ago. The burned section looked worse in the dark, all black and skeletal. I'll start on the barn repair this week, Brennan said. We'll start on it, she said. He almost argued. He stopped himself. We'll start on it, he agreed. They put the horses up, all 4 of them, the riding horses and the pack horse and the roan mare, who had come up the canyon trail in November looking as tired as her rider. The roan was better now, filled out and easier in her movement, in the way horses improved when they were fed properly and worked within their capacity. He'd noticed it incrementally over the winter and hadn't said anything because it wasn't his horse to comment on and because some things were just good to know quietly. Inside, Evelyn made supper, something simple, because they were both running on very little and the day had been long. They ate at the scarred table with the lantern between them and Rex at their feet, and the smell of the evening coming in under the door. The sound of the creek below, the sound of the canyon settling into night. At some point he looked across the table at her and she was already looking at him, and for a moment neither of them said anything. There was something between them that hadn't been there in November, and hadn't been there in January, and had been growing so incrementally since then that it was hard to point to any single moment when it had arrived. It was not simple, it was not comfortable. It was the kind of thing that could be examined too directly and break, or avoided entirely and harden into something less. He didn't know what to do with it yet. She looked back at her plate. Long day, she said. Long week, he said. They cleaned up. She went to her room. He sat by the stove for a while with the dog at his feet the way he'd done for 12 years. Except that the cabin was different now, in the way a place became different when someone had lived in it long enough to leave their mark. The reorganized shelves, the notes in the ledger margins, the seeds sorted on the south windowsill by planting date, the pair of gloves she'd left on the chair across from him because she'd been using them and hadn't put them away. And the imperfection of that, the simple human evidence of another person existing here, was something he'd stopped trying to ignore. He didn't know what to call what he was feeling. He knew it was real. He knew it had changed him in ways he hadn't consented to, which was how real things usually arrived. Outside, the canyon was quiet. The deputy would come. The evidence would be examined. The community was watching. Veronica Hale had started something she'd expected to end quickly, and she had underestimated both of them in ways that were about to become a problem for her. But tonight, all of that was tomorrow's work. Brennan put out the lamp. In the dark, the cabin was just a cabin again. The sounds of it familiar, the smell of it, the particular mixture of wood smoke and the salve he'd applied to Evelyn's hands, and the coffee from the morning and the old wood of the walls. Rex breathed slowly on the floor. Down the hall, behind the door of the small room that had been a storeroom once, he heard her move, and then settle, and then go still. He lay on his back in the dark and looked at the ceiling. He'd looked at for 12 years, and the thought he didn't examine too closely came anyway, clear and unhurried. He did not want her to leave. He sat with that for a while. Then he closed his eyes. Marshal Sewell's deputy arrived on a Wednesday, 5 days after their visit to Harwick. His name was Cord, young enough that his face still held on to something unfinished about it, but he moved around the burn site with a careful eye and didn't ask unnecessary questions, which Brennan respected. He spent 2 hours examining the physical evidence, made his own sketches of the boot print, what remained of it after the days of exposure, and took the burlap fragment with him in a cloth envelope, noting the documentation chain in a small ledger he carried for the purpose. Before he left, he stood at the edge of the yard and looked at the damaged barn with the expression of someone who was calculating something he wasn't ready to say out loud. "You have enemies," he said finally. It wasn't a question. "One specific one," Evelyn said. Cord looked at her, then at Brennan. Marshal Sewell will want a formal deposition from both of you within the month. I'd suggest you come back in 2 weeks, once I've had time to present what I've found." He picked up his saddlebags. "Don't make any public accusations before then." "We understand," Evelyn said. After he rode out, Brennan started on the barn repair. There was nothing to be done about the legal situation in the next 2 weeks except wait. And waiting had never been something he was comfortable with, which meant that work was the only viable response. He pulled the damaged boards, assessed what could be salvaged, and made a lumber list that was longer than he wanted and shorter than it could have been. The wall structure had held better than he'd feared in the immediate aftermath. The remaining posts were solid, and what was lost was primarily cladding and the floor section near the corner. Evelyn worked beside him that first morning, sorting salvageable materials from loss, until he said, "Your hands." She looked at them. The redness had faded, but the skin was still tender, still healing. "They're functional. They're not ready for rough lumber yet. Give it another few days." She looked at him with the expression that meant she was deciding whether to argue. He returned it steadily. This was a negotiation they'd had before, in different forms. The negotiation about limits, about when pushing through was necessary and when it was just stubbornness. "I'll work the interior sorting," she said. "Nothing that requires grip strength." "That works." She went to the interior. He went back to the outer wall. They worked through the morning without much conversation, which was fine. They'd gotten good at the comfortable kind of silence, the kind that wasn't a distance but just two people occupying the same space without needing to fill it. Around midday, she appeared at the barn door. "Ada Holt is coming." He heard the horse then, Ada's distinctive quick-stepping gray, coming down the trail at a pace that meant she had something to say. She pulled up in the yard and didn't dismount, which also meant something. "There's talk in Ridgepoint," Ada said. She looked at both of them, and her expression was careful in the way of someone who is about to deliver information that is going to matter. "About the fire. Hale's version is already in circulation. She's saying it was an accident, lamp left burning in the barn, carelessness." "Of course she is," Evelyn said, "and she's added something." Ada's jaw tightened. "She's saying that the property has been mismanaged, that it's a liability to the water system for the whole valley, that if it were in more capable hands, the creek access would be properly maintained and available to everyone." She paused. "She's framing herself as a community solution." Brennan set down the board he was holding. "She's rewriting the story," Evelyn said. "Not with surprise, with recognition. Before ours can establish itself." "She's got more reach in Ridgepoint than you do," Ada said, plainly. "She buys from merchants there, employs people from there in season. That matters to some people more than the truth does." She looked at Evelyn directly. "I'm not saying they're right. I'm saying that's what you're up against." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Then, "Who's listening to her? Alt isn't. Harmon at the feed store isn't. But the new man who bought the Pell property last fall, Graves, I think. He doesn't know the history, and she's been talking to him." Ada shifted in the saddle. "There might be others I haven't heard yet." After Ada left, they stood in the yard for a minute. The canyon was quiet around them, the kind of quiet that had started to feel like something that belonged to them, the specific texture of this particular place at this particular hour. "She's moving faster than I expected," Evelyn said. "She knows the deputy came. She's trying to get ahead of whatever the marshal's office finds." "Yes." Evelyn turned back toward the cabin. "I need to write some letters." Over the next 3 days, she wrote 6 letters. Brennan knew this because he could hear the pen moving in the evenings after supper, and because she occasionally asked him to confirm specific dates or facts from memory, the exact date of the survey agent's visit, the precise wording of the boundary dispute papers, the date they'd registered the marriage in Ridgepoint. He answered each question and didn't ask what the letters were for, because he'd learned by now that she would tell him when it mattered, and that the telling would be more useful once she'd thought it through. On the 4th evening, she spread the letters on the table after supper. "I want you to read these," she said. He read them. The first 2 were to land records offices, one at the county level, one at the territorial level, requesting copies of every filing made by Hale Ranch touching the Cutter Creek watershed in the past 10 years. The request was framed in the specific language of a property rights inquiry, formal and neutral. But the intent was clear if you knew what you were looking at. She was building a complete picture of Hale's activity along the creek over time. The third letter was to Aldrich, the Boise lawyer, with a summary of the arson and the deputy's visit, and a request for his assessment of whether the survey dispute and the fire could be linked in a legal argument. The fourth letter was to a woman named Clara Prentice at the Territorial Land Commissioner's office. Not an official inquiry, but a personal one, and the tone of it was different from the others. More direct, more familiar. Evelyn knew this woman. Brennan looked up. Who is she? She was a friend of my mother's. She's been in the commissioner's office for 12 years. She knows where records are kept that aren't necessarily easy to find. Evelyn met his eyes. I'm asking her to look at whether there have been other property challenges initiated by Hale Ranch that didn't go through the standard public process. You think there are? I think a woman who is willing to commission arson and spread deliberate misinformation in a community has probably done other things. And things leave records. She tapped the letter. Records don't disappear on their own. Someone has to actively remove them, and that's harder than it sounds. The fifth letter was to Tom Holt, asking him to gather signed statements from the other downstream property holders about their water access history. Specifically, any time they'd been pressured, incentivized, or approached by anyone connected to Hale Ranch. The sixth letter was the one that surprised him. It was addressed to a newspaper in Boise. Not a sensational piece, not a public accusation. A careful, factual account of the property situation in the Canyon District, framed as a question about water rights and frontier land law, and signed with her name. Not Brennan's name. Hers. He read it twice. This is going to make her angry. She's already angry, Evelyn said. This makes her visible. A newspaper article about water rights law isn't going to put her in front of a judge. No, but it starts a conversation that's harder to control than a rumor in Ridgepoint. She folded the letter carefully. She's been working in a closed system. People know what she wants them to know. This opens it. She paused. My father did this once. In the land dispute when I was 17, he wrote a letter to a paper. He was careful about it. Nothing actionable, no direct accusations. Just facts, asked as questions. The effect was that suddenly, other people who'd had dealings with the same opponent started talking to each other. Connections got made. A pattern became visible. Brennan looked at her across the table. The lantern between them threw its familiar light. You've been planning this since before the fire. I've been planning for the possibility of something like this since February, she said. Since Ada came with the first warning, I hoped it wouldn't be necessary. She was straightforward about it, not defensive. I'm not sorry I was prepared. He shook his head slowly. Not disagreeing. Something else. The specific feeling that came when you fully understood the depth of someone's competence for the first time. Not the surface of it, but the actual reach. Send them, he said. She sent them the next morning when she rode to Ridgepoint for supplies. She went alone. Brennan was on a critical phase of the barn repair, and she'd pointed that out practically, and he'd agreed practically, and they'd both understood that the practical reason was also a way of saying that she didn't need him to do this for her. She came back with the supplies, the confirmation that the letters were sent, and a piece of information from Alt that she delivered at supper with a quietness that meant it was significant. Hale's man was in Ridgepoint again this morning, she said. The same one who came with the boundary dispute papers. Brennan looked up. The one Rex reacted to. Yes. She served the food. His name is Deacon. He works directly for Hale, not a ranch hand. More of an errand man. She paused. Alt says he asked whether we'd been seen meeting with the deputy, whether anyone knew what we'd given him. She's trying to find out how much we have. Which means she doesn't know. Evelyn sat down. If she knew exactly what the deputy took with him, she'd be working a different angle. She's operating with incomplete information. She picked up her fork. That's the first real advantage we've had. The 2 weeks before the Harwick deposition moved the way all waiting moved. Too slowly when you needed them to pass, too quickly when you needed to prepare. The barn repair consumed most of Brennan's daylight hours. He worked with the focused, physical absorption of someone who understood that a thing repaired was a thing reclaimed. And by the end of the second week, the east wall was framed and half-clad, the floor section replaced, the structure no longer looking like evidence of what had happened to it. He wasn't a man who usually found satisfaction in the evidence of his own work. He found it now, somewhat to his own surprise. The planting was also underway. Evelyn managed it in the hours around the supply and documentation work, pulling him in when she needed 2 people, directing his labor with the specific precision she brought to anything she'd planned carefully. The south field was further along than he'd expected it to be at this point in the season. The bean section she'd designated in the corner with better drainage was already showing first green above the soil. "They're early," he said one morning, looking at the row. "I know." She was pleased, trying not to show it too much. "The soil here is better than the rest of the field. I thought it might be." "You didn't mention that." "I didn't want to make a claim before I had evidence for it." She moved on to the next row. "Now I have evidence." He looked at the green shoots and thought about the account book with its margins full of her handwriting, about the letters she'd sent, about the careful, patient architecture of a person who never claimed a thing until she could support it. "Your father would be proud," he said. He said it before he decided to say it, which was unusual for him. She stopped moving for a moment. He saw her shoulders change. A brief thing, a tightening and releasing. And then she was moving again, steady as always. "I think he would," she said quietly. "I think about it sometimes. Whether I'm making the decisions he would have made." "You're making the decisions he taught you to make," Brennan said. "That's not the same thing, but it might be better." She looked back at him over her shoulder. The morning light was on her face, and she looked tired and capable and real in the way she always looked when he let himself actually look at her, and the thing he'd been sitting with since the night after the fire was right there between them, patient as the canyon. "That's one of the kindest things you've said to me," she told him. "Don't get used to it," he said. She turned away, but he caught the shape of her mouth changing. That almost smile she'd been rationing since November, slightly less rationed now. He went back to work. The deposition in Harwick went for nearly 4 hours. Marshal Sewell conducted it himself, which Evelyn had said on the ride out was a good sign. It meant the deputy's report had elevated the matter to a level that required his personal attention. They sat across a wide desk from him in a room that smelled of old documents and the specific dry warmth of a building that had been heated through many winters. And they answered his questions with the same care they'd put into the written account. Sewell was thorough. He asked about the survey dispute first, its timeline, the papers Hale's agent had brought, the 1879 correction that Evelyn had found. He asked about any previous pressure or contact from Hale Ranch. He asked about the night of the fire in detail that was slightly uncomfortable, the precise sequence of events, who was where, what they smelled and when, what they saw when they reached the barn. Then he set his pen down and looked at them over the desk. "I'm going to tell you something," he said, "not in an official capacity." "All right," Evelyn said. "The burlap fragment your deputy examined. The oil residue on it has a particular composition that's consistent with a specific type of lamp oil not commonly sold in the Canyon District." He paused. "It's sold at the depot in the South Valley, which is where Hale Ranch sources its supply." The room was quiet for a moment. "That's not conclusive," Evelyn said carefully. "No, it's not. But it's a thread." He picked up his pen again. "The boot print cast your deputy made. It's a size that matches a work boot sold by one supplier in the territory. That supplier's records show a purchase in that size by an individual named Deacon, listed as an agent of Hale Ranch, 8 months ago." He looked at her directly. Again, not conclusive on its own. "But together with the survey dispute history and whatever Clara Prentice finds in the commissioner's records," Evelyn said slowly, "it becomes a pattern." Sewell's expression didn't change much, but something shifted in it. "You've contacted the commissioner's office. I've asked a contact there to look at the filing history for land disputes involving Hale Ranch on the Cutter Creek watershed." A long pause. "Has your contact responded?" "Not yet." Sewell looked at Brennan. "You're very quiet." "She's saying the right things," Brennan said. "I don't have anything to add." Something that was almost amusement moved across Sewell's face and disappeared. He made a note. "I'm going to open a formal inquiry into the arson. That's established. I'm also going to recommend that the boundary dispute filing be placed under review pending the outcome of the inquiry, which will effectively suspend it." He set his pen down again. "Mrs. Vale, when your contact in the commissioner's office responds, I'd ask that you bring that information to me directly, not to any other party." "Of course," she said. "And I'd ask you both to continue being careful." He looked at each of them. A formal inquiry creates pressure. Pressure makes people unpredictable. They rode back through the long afternoon. Neither of them spoke for the first several miles, which was its own kind of conversation, the processing kind, where the events of the last few hours settled into their proper weight. "Deacon," Brennan said finally. "Yes." "He was careless, using identifiable materials. He was confident," she said. "He expected it to work. He expected us to take the loss and fold." She shifted on the roan. "Confident people are often careless because they've never had to be anything else." Hale too. Hale too. She was quiet for a moment. She's never had someone push back the way we're pushing back. Not from this direction. She's used to winning financially or legally, or through social pressure. She's not used to someone who has documentation and is willing to use it systematically. A pause. We're not what she planned for. 3 days after the Harwick deposition, a letter arrived from Clara Prentice. Evelyn read it at this table while Brennan stood by the window. She read it once, then again. Then she set it down with a deliberateness that told him what she'd found before she said a word. "There are 4 other property disputes," she said, "in the last 9 years. All of them on creek access land. All of them resolved in Hale Ranch's favor." She looked up. 3 of those resolutions involved property sales under price. The former owners all left the territory within a year. The 4th involved a legal challenge that was dropped after the challenger's primary witness recanted. She paused. Clara found an inconsistency in the filing on that one. The boundary survey used in the challenge had been amended. The amendment is dated 3 weeks before the challenge was dropped. Clara cross-referenced the surveyor's signature against other documents. The signature doesn't match. Forged. Almost certainly, which means Hale, or someone working for her, falsified a territorial land survey. She pressed her palms flat on the table. That's not a civil matter. That's not a property dispute. That's fraud against the territory. Brennan looked at her. The afternoon light was coming through the window behind him. Rex was at the door, his nose against the gap at the bottom. Something in the air outside had caught his attention. The creek ran its low sound below the canyon. Everything was the way it was every afternoon. "We need to get that to Sewell immediately," he said. "I know." She was already folding the letter back into its envelope. This is what she was afraid of. This is what all of it was for. The boundary dispute, the rumors, the fire. She was trying to shut us down before we found the time and the stability to find this. Her voice was steady, but there was something underneath it. If we'd left, if the fire had worked, if the rumors had broken the community trust we'd built, they didn't. No. She held the envelope in her careful hands, still healing, still marked by what the fire had cost her. They didn't. He crossed the room and sat down across from her, close enough that she'd know he was there without him needing to say anything particular about it. "We should go to Harwick first thing tomorrow," he said. "Yes." She set the envelope on the table. "Brennan." "What?" She looked at him directly, in that specific way she had that meant she was going to say something that mattered and wasn't going to package it carefully. "I need you to know that I understand what this might mean. If we take this to Sewell and it goes where I think it goes, Hale has resources and connections we can't fully map. She may find ways to make this more difficult before it gets better. It may not be—" She stopped, started again. "It may not be clean. I know that. I need to know you're still in this. All the way through, however long it takes." He looked at her. He thought about November, a woman with dark circles under her eyes and raw cheeks from the cold, riding up a canyon trail on a tired horse to knock on a door most people went around. He thought about the note in his coat pocket about the East water pipe, about the almost smile she rationed, about the morning after the fire when he'd said come inside and she'd come, and sitting at the table with her hands in his, he'd understood something about the difference between a person you were obligated to and a person you didn't want to lose. "Evelyn," he said, "when have I given you the impression that I fold?" She held his gaze for a moment. Then she made a small sound. Not quite a laugh, but something that started the same way. "You haven't," she said. "I just needed to hear it." "You heard it." They rode to Harwick the next morning with Clara Prentice's letter and a copy Evelyn had made of the key documents it referenced. Sewell read the letter in his office while they sat across from him, and his expression moved through several things in the space of 2 minutes: assessment, recognition, and then a final settling into something that was serious in a way his usual serious wasn't. "This is the commissioner's office, not a private citizen," he said. "Yes," Evelyn said. "A falsified territorial survey is a criminal act under territorial law. It triggers an automatic review process at the federal level if the marshal's office substantiates the claim." He set the letter down. "If this is what it appears to be, this matter goes well beyond your property dispute." "I know," Evelyn said. "Mrs. Vale." He leaned forward slightly. "I'm going to ask you something, and I want a direct answer. Do you have enemies other than Hale Ranch? Anyone who might want to muddy this water by contesting the integrity of these documents?" "No," she said. "We have neighbors who are cautious, and a cattle baron who wants our land, and that's the extent of it." He studied her for a long moment. "You understand that once I move forward with this formally, I can't control the pace of it. These things take on their own momentum." "I understand. Take it forward." Sewell looked at Brennan, who had been sitting in the same steadiness he'd held through the whole meeting. "You agree?" "She speaks for both of us," Brennan said. "She's been right about everything else." Something crossed Sewell's face that wasn't quite a smile, but was in the neighborhood of one. He picked up his pen. "All right," he said. "Let's get started." The formal inquiry opened within the week. It moved through the territory with the specific momentum that Sewell had warned them about, slow at first, then faster than expected, then suddenly very public. Hale Ranch's attorney entered the process loudly, which Aldrich had anticipated and written to them about, assuring them it was a predictable response, and that noise wasn't the same as strength. The community in the Canyon District learned the full shape of the situation through the channels that communities use. Ada Holt, primarily, who communicated with the focused efficiency of a woman who'd spent 40 years knowing which conversations needed to happen and making sure they did. Tom Holt made his statement to the marshal's office formally. Cartwright made his. Two of the former property owners who'd sold underpriced to Hale Ranch were located by Sewell's office and agreed to speak. The newspaper letter that Evelyn had sent to Boise ran 6 weeks after she'd sent it, which was slower than she'd hoped but still within the window where it mattered. It appeared on the front page of the Land and Territory section, framed as a question about water rights policy, and within 2 weeks 3 other papers in the territory had picked up the story, and the question had become a conversation, and the conversation had found its way back to the specific facts of Hale Ranch and the Cutter Creek watershed and a falsified survey. Veronica Hale did not respond publicly, which was, Evelyn said when she read the papers, more telling than any statement she could have made. "She's calculating," Brennan said. "She's cutting losses," Evelyn said, "calculating what she can still protect and what she has to let go." She folded the paper. "She thought we were the weakest point in her operation. She was wrong, and now that's visible to everyone who matters." She set the paper on the table. "She won't recover from that. Not completely." The morning after this Boise paper arrived, Brennan woke early. Earlier than usual, before the light was fully in the sky. Before the canyon had shifted from its night sounds to its day sounds. He lay there for a moment in the particular quiet of a situation that had changed while you were sleeping, that had moved from one category to another while you weren't paying attention. Then he got up, put the coffee on, and stood at the window. He heard her door and her step, and then she was there beside him at the window with her cup, looking out at the canyon in the early gray light. The creek ran below. The walls of the canyon were dark stone against a lightening sky. "It's almost over," she said. "Not quite yet." "No." She looked out. "But almost." He looked at her profile. The months had changed her. Not aged her, but settled her. The desperate steadiness of November had become something more grounded. She looked like someone who'd been tested and had come through it with a more accurate knowledge of herself than she'd started with. He thought she probably looked the same to her. "Evelyn," he said. "I want to say something." She turned to look at him. She had the alert stillness she got when she sensed the conversation was going to matter. He'd been practicing this, imperfectly, in the way that someone who was not built for this kind of speech practiced something that didn't come naturally. He'd run through various versions in his head over the past weeks, articulate versions, concise versions, versions that were honest without being excessive. In the end, standing here in the early light, the only version that came was the plainest one. "I know this wasn't what either of us planned. he said. What we started with wasn't what this has become. I'm aware of that. He looked at her. And I want you to know that I'm glad it became this, whatever it is. He stopped, because the words were running out in the specific way they always did when something mattered too much. I'm not easy. I know I'm not easy. But I'm in this. All of it. Not because of your father's letter, because of you. She was very still. Then she set her cup down on the windowsill and looked at him with the expression that wasn't rationed at all, open and real, and something he had no word for except that it was the truest thing he'd seen in a very long time. I know, she said quietly. I've known for a while. You might have mentioned it. You weren't ready. The almost smile. I was waiting. He looked at her. Is that right? I'm patient, she said. You've noticed. The light was coming up in the canyon now, the first of it touching the top of the walls, the stone going from dark to amber in the way it did every morning. Rex appeared at the interior door, looked at both of them, and went to his bowl. The coffee's ready, she said. I know, he said. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then they poured the coffee, and the day began, and outside the canyon held its light. The formal hearing took place in Harwick on a Thursday in late June, 6 weeks after Sewell had opened the inquiry, and roughly 8 months after a tired woman on a tired horse had come up the canyon trail and knocked on a door she had no guarantee would open. The territorial hearing room was a plain, high-ceilinged space that smelled of sawdust and paper and the particular staleness of a building used for official purposes. Brennan and Evelyn sat on one side of the room with Aldrich, who had come up from Boise for the occasion, and who turned out to be a compact, deliberate man in his 50s with the quiet authority of someone who'd been right about things long enough that he no longer needed to perform confidence. On the other side sat Hale Ranch's legal representation, 2 attorneys from the county seat, both of them better dressed than anyone else in the room, which Aldrich had told them in a letter meant nothing except that they charged more. Veronica Hale herself was present. Brennan had seen her once before, at a distance, when she'd come to make her offer on the property 2 years back. A tall woman, somewhere in her 50s, with the particular bearing of someone who'd held power long enough that it had stopped feeling like something she held and started feeling like something she was. She sat beside her attorneys with an expression of careful composure that cost her something to maintain. He could see that it cost her. He didn't take pleasure in it, exactly. He noted it. Evelyn didn't look at Hale. She looked at the documents in front of her, and at Aldrich and at the territorial adjudicator behind the central table, a methodical woman named Forsyth who had been assigned from outside the county specifically to avoid conflicts of interest. The hearing went for most of the day. Adjudicator Forsyth was precise and unhurried. She worked through the boundary dispute first, the 1879 survey, the correction documentation, the question of the filing's legitimacy. Hale's attorneys made their arguments carefully, but the documentation Evelyn had assembled was airtight, and when Aldrich presented the 1879 correction alongside the original claim, the discrepancy was clear enough that Forsyth asked Hale's lead attorney to explain it, and the explanation that came back was noticeably thin. Then came the survey fraud. Clara Prentice had traveled from the commissioner's office herself, which Evelyn hadn't expected and which clearly hadn't been anticipated by Hale's attorneys either. Prentice was a small woman with precise movements and the air of someone who'd spent years surrounded by documents and had developed a deep personal offense at the idea of those documents being falsified. She presented the inconsistent survey amendment with the focused calm of someone who'd been building toward this moment for years without knowing it. When the signature comparison was placed before Forsyth, the falsified amendment alongside 3 authenticated documents bearing the actual surveyor's signature, the room went very quiet. Not the quiet of people who didn't understand what they were looking at, the quiet of people who understood exactly. Hale's lead attorney requested a recess. Forsyth granted 15 minutes. Brennan and Evelyn stepped outside into the June heat with Aldrich. The street in front of the hearing building was ordinary. People going about their afternoon business, horses at the hitching posts, a dog sleeping in the shade of the general store across the way. The world outside was entirely indifferent to what was happening inside. How does it look? Brennan asked Aldrich. It looks the way it looks, Aldrich said, which was his way of saying he didn't make predictions. The fraud finding is going to hold, that's established. What happens to the arson inquiry separately is Sewell's domain, not this hearing. He looked at Evelyn. You did good work with the documentation, better than most. My father taught me, she said. Whoever taught you, it held up. He straightened his jacket. Let's go back in. When the hearing reconvened, Hale's lead attorney stood and made a brief statement. Hale Ranch was withdrawing the boundary dispute claim in its entirety. The language was careful and bloodless, in the interest of resolution, acknowledging certain procedural irregularities. And it said everything it needed to say without admitting to anything specific, which was the nature of that kind of language. Forsyth received the withdrawal, noted it in the record, and then looked over the room with the expression of someone who had more to say. The withdrawal of the civil claim does not close the matter of the fraudulent survey amendment, she said. That finding will be referred to the Territorial Attorney General's office for further review. The parties involved in the filing of that amendment will be identified and notified accordingly. She looked at Hale's table directly. This office takes a serious view of fraud against territorial records. I want that noted clearly. Hale held her composure. But something around her eyes had changed, a tightening, a shift. It was the look of a person who had just fully understood the difference between a problem she could manage and a problem that had grown beyond her management. The hearing adjourned. Outside afterward, in the warm afternoon, Ada Holt was waiting. She'd ridden up from the Canyon District specifically, and she stood by her horse with her arms crossed and watched them come out with an expression that took in everything she needed to know. Well, she said. The dispute is withdrawn, Evelyn said. The fraud finding goes to the Attorney General. Ada was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded once, in the deep way of someone who's been waiting for the right outcome for a long time. Good, she said. That's the right result. She looked at Brennan. Tom says you should come for supper sometime, both of you. He's been saying it since February, and I keep forgetting to relay it. Tell him we will, Brennan said. Tell him yourself. That's why we have horses. She mounted and looked down at them. Come soon. We've earned a meal that isn't about any of this. She rode off. Brennan and Evelyn stood in the street for a moment, and the afternoon moved around them. The ordinary Thursday business of a frontier town, people who didn't know and didn't need to know what had just concluded inside that building. It's done, Evelyn said, most of it. The arson inquiry will take longer. Deacon's name is in the record. Hale's attorneys will try to contain it. She paused. But it's in the record. It doesn't go away. He looked at her. She was tired. The good kind of tired. The kind that came after something finished rather than the kind that came from something unresolved. Her hands were fully healed now, no trace of the fire damage visible except if you knew to look. She was standing in the June light of a street in Harwick, with her hair slightly undone from the day and her coat over her arm, and the expression of a person who had just done a hard thing completely. Let's go home, he said. She looked at him when he said it. The word home landed between them with its full weight. Not casually, not without meaning. He'd said it deliberately. She knew that. Yes, she said. Let's go home. The ride back through the canyon country in the long summer evening was different from every ride they'd made before it. The urgency was gone. What was left was the land itself, the stone walls catching the last of the light, the creek audible below the trail, the particular smell of a June evening in Idaho that was dust and sage and something green underneath both. Brennan had ridden this trail in every season for 12 years. He knew every turn of it. He'd never noticed, before this particular evening, how much he'd wanted someone to ride it with. Veronica Hale left the territory before August. It happened without announcement. The ranch operation transferred to a management company, the main house shuttered, and then she was simply gone. The territory absorbed her departure the way it absorbed most things. Noted, discussed briefly, then filed away under the category of events that had concluded. The arson inquiry, as Evelyn had predicted, moved slowly. Deacon was eventually identified, brought in for questioning, and reached a legal arrangement that involved his cooperation. Whether Hale herself would face formal consequence for what had been done in her name was a question that would take years to fully resolve, if it ever did. Aldrich kept them informed. The process was what it was. Imperfect, partial, grinding forward at its own pace. Brennan had trouble with that, in the way he always had trouble with things that couldn't be resolved cleanly. Evelyn was better at the long patience of it. The fraud finding is in the territorial record, she told him one evening when he'd been sitting in the particular silence that meant he was chewing on something unpleasant. That doesn't disappear. Whoever she is, wherever she goes, that record exists. People who deal with her in the future will find it if they look. She looked at him across the table. That's not nothing. It's not everything either. No, she agreed. It rarely is. He looked at his hands. Your father's way of thinking. And yours now, whether you like it or not. She went back to what she was reading. You've changed. Don't tell anyone. I think people have noticed, she said simply. She wasn't wrong. Something had shifted in how the Canyon District related to Brennan Vale. Not dramatically, not overnight, but in the accumulating way of a reputation that gets rebuilt one interaction at a time. Tom Holt had started stopping by for reasons that weren't urgent. Cartwright had asked his opinion once about a fence line disagreement with a property to his east, and Brennan had given it plainly, and Cartwright had acted on it, and the thing had resolved. Alton Ridgepoint talked to him differently, less carefully, more directly. He attributed much of it to Evelyn, which was accurate, and which she deflected when he said it. I didn't change how people see you, she said. I changed what you were willing to do in front of them. He thought about that for a long time. There was truth in it that was uncomfortable the way true things often were. He'd been hiding in the canyon for years, not from the world exactly, but from the friction of it. The particular friction of being known, of being in relationship with people who might judge or need or want things from you. It was easier to be left alone. Easier and slower and smaller than he'd quite admitted. She'd arrived and made retreat unavailable. Not by force, just by being there. Needing things, offering things, pulling him incrementally into a life that involved other people, whether he was ready for it or not. He was not going to tell her she'd rescued him. He had too much pride for that, and also it wasn't quite right. Rescue implied he'd been helpless, and he hadn't been helpless. He'd been stuck. There was a difference. She'd unstuck him. He could acknowledge that internally. The summer moved. The South Field produced beyond what either of them had projected. The bean section in the good drainage corner was particularly strong, and they had enough surplus to sell a portion in Ridgepoint and trade a portion to the Holts under the seed-sharing arrangement that had already paid off for both operations. Evelyn updated the account book and told him the numbers, and the numbers were the best they'd been since he'd started keeping records. We're not secure, she said, because she never overstated. But we're stable, and stable is the foundation of the next thing. The next thing, he repeated. There's a portion of the North Field that's been sitting unworked. The soil's different up there, rockier. But I've been reading about what grows well in that kind of ground. She turned the account book toward him, pointing to a rough sketch she'd made in the back. Orchard. Apples and something hardier. It takes years before it produces, which means we start it now. He looked at the sketch. It was optimistic. The kind of plan that assumed they'd both still be here in 5 years and 10 years and beyond, working the same ground. He found he didn't mind the assumption. We'll need more fencing, he said. I know. I've already priced it. Of course you have. She looked at him with the expression that was no longer almost a smile. It was by now a full one, still contained, still hers, but real. Are we doing it? Yes, he said. We're doing it. There was a night in late August when they sat on the porch after supper, a thing they'd started doing in the warm months, simply sitting outside in the dark with the canyon sounds around them and Rex between their chairs, old and content and occasionally chasing something in his sleep. The sky above the canyon walls was dense with stars, in the way it only was this far from any town, the kind of sky that made the question of scale feel very immediate and the question of ordinary human problems feel not small exactly, but properly sized. Evelyn said, I want to tell you something. All right. She was looking at the sky. When I rode up here in November, I was more afraid than I showed. I think you knew that. I knew. I wasn't afraid of you specifically, she said. I was afraid of what it meant, that I was out of options, that this was what was left. She paused. I thought it would be a transaction. I thought I could manage it cleanly the way you manage anything you need to survive. He waited. I was wrong about what it would be. She looked at him now. And I want you to know that I don't think of it that way anymore. Haven't for a long time. She stopped, which was unusual. She was rarely at a loss for words once she'd decided to say something. I love you. I don't say that as a transaction either. I say it because it's true, and because you said something honest to me in the spring, and I owe you the same honesty back. The canyon made its sounds around them. The creek below. Rex breathing. Brennan looked at her for a long moment. The feeling that had been living in him since he couldn't pinpoint when, that was the honest answer, it had arrived so gradually that he hadn't known it until it was already there, moved through him with a completeness that was slightly alarming and mostly right. I know, he said. I've known for a while. She made a sound. Now you use my words. They were good words. They were. She looked back at the sky. A smile, real and full and unhurried, settled on her face in the dark. He reached over and put his hand over hers on the arm of the chair. Not reaching, not tentative, just present. She turned her hand over and held his, and they sat like that while the canyon settled into its deep nighttime quiet and the stars moved slowly overhead, and Rex dreamed whatever old dogs dream. He thought about Thomas Mercer writing a letter in the morning before he died, about the specific faith it took to hand your child's future to someone else's character and trust that the character would hold. About the strange, unasked-for gift of being trusted that way. Not because you'd earned it perfectly, but because someone had seen you clearly, scars and history and rough edges and all, and decided you were worth the bet. He thought about what it cost to be seen clearly and not run from it. He'd spent 12 years in this canyon getting very good at not being seen, and then she'd arrived and looked at him without flinching and waited with her particular patience until he'd stopped performing the solitude he'd convinced himself he needed. He wasn't a different man. That was the thing he'd needed to understand. The version that had existed before November hadn't been wrong exactly, just incomplete. He was the same man with more of himself available, more willing to be in the world, to be known by it, to let it cost something. That was her doing. Not by design, but by presence, just by being a person who showed up fully and didn't leave. It wasn't a comfortable lesson, the best ones rarely were. The fall came, and with it the work of preparation that the canyon required. Firewood, stores, the winterizing of the repaired barn that now stood solid against the east wall, the new section of siding slightly lighter in color than the old, the evidence of the fire visible only if you were looking for it. Brennan had left it that way deliberately. He wasn't sure why exactly. Some instinct about not pretending that hard things hadn't happened. Evelyn had understood without being told. She'd looked at the new siding once, when it was finished, and said nothing. That was enough. In October, 2 families in the Lower Canyon came to them separately with problems. The Brenshaws had a water access dispute with a new settler who'd moved in upstream and redirected a secondary channel. Legal enough on its face, but practically devastating for their stock in a dry year. The other family, the Devereaux, had a sick child and a husband laid up with a broken arm, and the harvest half done and the weather turning. Brennan helped the Devereaux with the harvest. 3 days, working alongside the Devereaux's eldest son, a boy of 16 who was trying hard to hold something together that was too heavy for him alone. Brennan didn't say much. He worked. On the 3rd day, when the last of it was in, the boy looked at him with the expression of someone who wasn't sure how to say the thing they needed to say. "We're grateful," the boy finally managed. "It needed doing," Brennan said, which was all he knew how to offer, but the boy seemed to understand it as the thing it actually was. Evelyn handled the Brenshaw water dispute differently. She spent 2 evenings helping them draft a formal complaint using the same documentation logic she'd applied to their own situation. And she walked them through the process with the patience of someone who'd been through it and knew where the obstacles were. The complaint was filed. The new settler, confronted with a formal process, and no doubt aware of what had recently happened to Hale Ranch's legal adventures in the same district, resolved the issue within a week. Ada Holt heard about both things and came by the following Saturday with a pie and an expression that was as close to approval as Ada's face ever got. "You're becoming useful to people," she said. "Apparently," Brennan said. "Don't say it like it's a complaint." Ada set the pie on the table and looked at Evelyn. "This one's been useful since she got here. You took a while." "I did," he agreed. Ada looked between them with the sharp, satisfied eye of a woman who'd seen this particular development coming long before either of them had. "Tom says, come for supper Sunday." "We'll be there," Evelyn said. After Ada left, Brennan stood in the middle of the room for a moment. Rex was at his feet. The cabin smelled of the pie and the wood smoke and coffee, and the particular mixture that was just the smell of the place. Inhabited, worked in, lived in. Not a homestead barely holding on. A home. Evelyn was at the table writing something, always writing something, and she looked up and found him standing there. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Just this." She looked at him. She understood what he meant because she'd gotten good at understanding what he meant, even when the words ran short, which was often. She looked back at her paper. "Yes," she said quietly. "This." He poured himself a cup of coffee and sat down across from her. Outside, the October wind moved through the canyon in its familiar way. Not the January cold that pressed and demanded, but the fall kind. The kind that had a smell to it. The smell of things changing and preparing and getting ready for what came next. He'd spent 12 years in this canyon, believing that getting through each winter was its own sufficient accomplishment. Survival as the goal, solitude as the method, the canyon walls as the definition of his world. He understood now that survival was only the floor. What you built on top of it was the actual question. What kind of person you were willing to be once staying alive wasn't the only thing requiring your attention. Thomas Mercer had known that. Had written it in a letter his daughter carried 100 miles on a tired horse, delivered to a man sitting alone in a canyon who had stopped asking himself what more was possible. The man on the other end of that letter had needed more time to catch up. He was catching up. Evelyn's pen moved across the page. Rex sighed in his sleep. The wind ran its hand along the outside wall, familiar and honest, and the fire held against it the way it always had. Not perfect, not without effort, but steady. Steady was enough. Steady, it turned out, was everything.